Jaden's footsteps were slow but steady as he walked through the wet streets of the desolate neighborhood. The city was a maze of abandoned buildings and cracked pavement, the air thick with the smell of mildew and forgotten promises. The rain had started to pour heavily, but Jaden barely noticed. He had learned to ignore the discomforts of life long ago. His thin jacket did little to protect him from the cold, but he was used to it. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten much today. As usual, he had scavenged for food in the back alleys, hoping for something that might fill the emptiness inside him, even for just a little while. He wasn't picky. Half a sandwich left behind by someone too busy to finish it, or a piece of fruit discarded in a trash can would be enough. It was the way things were for him, surviving day by day, always one step ahead of hunger and despair. Jaden made his way past a row of crumbling buildings, each one more decrepit than the last. He had found shelter for the night in one of them, a storage room that no one seemed to care about anymore. The space was small, but it was dry, and for tonight, that would have to be enough. But as he rounded the corner near an old, abandoned house, something caught his attention. It was faint at first, the sound barely audible over the rain and the wind. A cry, a baby's cry. Jaden froze, his heart suddenly racing. His eyes scanned the alley, searching for the source of the sound. The rain had soaked through his jacket, but he barely felt it. His mind raced. He was used to hearing the cries of children in the streets, but they were usually lost, abandoned by neglectful parents. He couldn't ignore this one. The cry was full of desperation, raw and heartbreaking. Someone needed help. Without thinking, Jaden rushed towards the alley, his footsteps splashing in the growing puddles. The sound led him to a dark corner, hidden from the main street. There, near the side of the old house, he found it. An infant, no more than a few months old, lying in a pile of discarded trash, wrapped in a dirty, torn blanket. The baby's face was red from crying, its tiny hands reaching out as if desperately searching for comfort. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anything like this before. He had heard stories of babies being abandoned, but to find one here, in the wet, cold night, all alone, it felt like a punch to his gut. Without thinking, Jaden knelt beside the baby, his hands shaking as he carefully lifted the child into his arms. The baby's cries subsided just slightly, as Jaden cradled it gently, trying to calm it with soft whispers. "Hey, it's okay," Jaden murmured, his voice full of tenderness. "You're safe now. I'll take care of you." He looked around, panic rising in his chest. He had no idea what to do. He had no parents, no shelter, and no resources to care for a baby. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The baby needed him, and he wasn't about to let it down. Jaden glanced back at the street, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could help. But the streets were empty, save for the rain, the distant sounds of the city, and the occasional crack of thunder. He was alone, and so was the baby. Determination filled him. He couldn't just leave the baby here. He had to do something. But where could he go? Where could he find safety for both of them? His mind raced through his few options. His old storage room. It wasn't the safest place for a child. The streets, even more dangerous. Then, as if by instinct, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't just stand there. He had to get the baby somewhere safe, somewhere where it could be cared for. Jaden held the baby close to his chest, his heart beat in sync with the infant's small, fragile breaths. His hands trembled as he stood up, but he moved forward with purpose. There was no turning back now. Jaden's heart raced as he approached the source of the faint cries, his eyes scanning the dimly lit alleyway. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, the kind of place that most people avoided. His fingers trembled, but it wasn't out of fear. It was out of uncertainty, an unfamiliar feeling welling up inside him. He had seen so many hardships in his young life, but nothing prepared him for what he was about to find. Turning a corner, Jaden's eyes fell on a broken-down building, the door hanging off its hinges like it hadn't been opened in years. As he stepped inside, the faint cries grew louder, urgent, and desperate. In the corner of the room, hidden beneath a layer of dust and forgotten debris, lay a tiny form. A baby girl. Wrapped in a thin, frayed blanket, the child lay motionless on the splintered wooden floor. Her skin, pale and cold, made her look as though she had been abandoned for much too long. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. He quickly moved forward, kneeling beside the baby, his hands shaking as he gently reached for her. Her tiny, fragile body was stiff, the little chest barely rising as she struggled to breathe. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. He couldn't break down now. He had to think. His mind raced. He didn't know what to do. He was just a boy. He barely had enough for himself. His small shelter was cold, and he didn't even know how he'd feed her. But there was no choice. He couldn't just leave her here. Without another thought, Jaden carefully scooped the baby into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if his warmth could transfer to her. The chill from her body sent a shiver through him, but he held her tight, wrapping her in his own shirt to keep her warm. She was so small, so fragile. He had to do something, anything. His footsteps echoed as he moved swiftly through the abandoned building, the weight of the baby in his arms reminding him of the magnitude of what he was about to undertake. He could feel his own hunger gnawing at his stomach, but he couldn't think of that now. He had to get her to safety. He had to protect her. The walk back to his small shelter felt like a lifetime. With each step, he weighed the reality of the situation. He had no food, no supplies, no help. It was just him. But something deeper within him, something he didn't quite understand, pushed him forward. He wouldn't let this baby girl die alone. He would find a way to save her. When he finally reached his makeshift home, a small abandoned room that he had found refuge in, Jaden carefully laid the baby down on a corner of the floor. He rummaged through his few belongings, finding an old jacket and a torn blanket to create a warmer spot for her. He sat down beside her, his heart still pounding in his chest. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but for the first time in his life, Jaden felt a surge of purpose. There was no turning back. He had made a decision. The baby would survive. He would make sure of it. Jaden's heart pounded as he walked through the crowded streets, the baby cradled in his arms. Her tiny whimpers filled the silence between the honking cars and the murmurs of passing pedestrians. He glanced down at the little girl, her fragile body wrapped in his thin jacket. The weight of her dependence was overwhelming, but he couldn't let her down. With a determined step, Jaden headed toward the small corner store on the busy block, hoping for a miracle. The sign outside read, "Local Groceries," a place he'd passed by countless times but never thought to enter. Today, it was his only hope. Inside, he moved quickly to the baby aisle, scanning the shelves for baby formula. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, but he pushed forward. He didn't care about the stares or the judgments anymore. He had to find something to feed her. The shopkeeper, a stern-faced man who looked barely interested in his customers, barely acknowledged Jaden as he picked up a tin of formula. "Excuse me, sir, how much for this?" Jaden asked. his voice shaky from both exhaustion and nerves. The shopkeeper looked up slowly, sizing him up. Jaden could tell he didn't think much of him. A young black boy, dressed in tattered clothes, holding a baby he had no business taking care of. He sighed heavily and shook his head. "That's $25, the man said flatly. "Do you have the money for it?" Jaden's stomach sank. He reached into his pockets, fingers brushing against the few coins he had. It wasn't enough, not even close. I don't have enough," Jaden mumbled, lowering his gaze. The shopkeeper didn't even look surprised. "Then you can't buy it," he said dismissively. "Maybe you should try begging somewhere else." Jaden felt the sting of those words, but he couldn't focus on that. He had to feed the baby. His mind raced with ideas, but none of them seemed good enough. He walked out of the store, feeling a sinking hopelessness. Outside, the cold air hit his face, sharp and unforgiving. Jaden looked down at the baby in his arms, her innocent eyes staring up at him. He couldn't let her down. He needed to find a way to help her. For hours, he wandered the streets, stopping anyone who looked like they might help. He approached businessmen, old women, even teenagers, anyone who might have a spare dollar or a kind heart. But time and time again, he was turned away. Some people ignored him, others looked at him with suspicion, and a few made snide comments about how he shouldn't be walking around with a baby like that. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, an elderly woman stopped in front of him. She had kind eyes, though her face was lined with age and hardship. Her clothes were modest, but there was a warmth to her presence that caught his attention. "What's the matter, son?" she asked, her voice gentle. She had seen him standing at the corner, holding the baby in his arms, looking helpless. I need to get formula for her," Jaden explained, voice tight with frustration. "But I don't have enough money. I've been trying all day." The woman studied him for a moment, and then her face softened. "You've been taking care of her, haven't you?" Jaden nodded, surprised at how someone could see through him so easily. "I'm trying. I just don't know how to get her the food she needs." She smiled and reached into her bag. "Come with me," she said, beckoning him toward a nearby store. They walked together in silence, and when they reached the small market, the woman went straight to the baby section, picking up a tin of formula. "Here," she said, pressing it into his hands. "This will help." Jaden couldn't believe it. He looked at the tin, then back at her. You really want me to have this?" She nodded. "I can't turn my back on someone who's trying their best. I've seen too many people walk away from others in need. You're doing the right thing. Now, you make sure she's taken care of." Overcome with gratitude, Jaden almost couldn't speak. He had been ignored, rejected, and looked down on all day, and here was this woman, offering him a lifeline when he'd almost given up. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." The woman smiled again, patting his shoulder. "You'll be fine, son. Take care of her." As he left the store, holding the tin of formula tightly in his hands, a sense of hope filled his chest. He wasn't alone. There were good people out there, people who saw his heart, not just the outside world that judged him. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could face it. He wasn't giving up on this little girl, and for the first time, he felt like he had a shot at making things right for both of them. Over the next 2 days, Jaden did everything he could to care for the baby. He kept her warm, fed her, and made sure she was as comfortable as possible in the abandoned building. He kept watch over her while he scavenged for more food for himself. His heart swelled with a love he hadn't known he was capable of. Despite all his struggles, he had found purpose in caring for her. And in return, she had brought him something he didn't expect: hope. Jaden walked through the bustling streets, his heart heavier with each step. For days, he had taken care of the baby, kept her warm, and given her the love and comfort he himself had rarely known. He had grown attached, her innocent face becoming a source of solace in the grim world he lived in. But now, as he overheard the conversation between two bystanders about the wealthy couple's missing child, his stomach twisted into knots. "Their daughter's been gone for 3 days now," one of the men said, his voice tinged with worry. "It was a kidnapping during that robbery downtown. They're offering a huge reward." Jaden froze. He turned his head slightly, trying not to make it obvious that he was eavesdropping. His mind raced as the pieces clicked together. The baby, the robbery, the kidnapping. His heart pounded as he wondered if this was the same child, the one he'd been caring for. But what did that mean for him? He wasn't the child's father. He wasn't even supposed to have her. She was supposed to be with her real family, not with someone like him. He glanced down at the baby, who was sleeping peacefully in his arms, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside him. The weight of the choice pressed down on him. What if he returned her, and they didn't believe him? What if the wealthy couple assumed he was the one who had kidnapped her? The thought of losing her, of being alone again, made him feel physically sick. This baby, this innocent soul had become his little companion. It had felt like family. But he knew deep down that the right thing to do was to give her back to her real family. Tears welled up in his eyes as he stood there, the weight of the decision suffocating him. He could feel his grip tightening around her tiny body, his fingers trembling. He had never been so afraid. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of being left with nothing again. With one last look at the baby, he wiped away a tear and turned in the direction of the police station. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about making sure she had the life she deserved. A life he couldn't provide, no matter how much he wished he could. Jaden's feet felt heavy as he walked, the familiar streets of his neighborhood now feeling like a vast, cold expanse. His breath caught in his chest as he approached the police station, his mind replaying all the what-ifs over and over. But there was no turning back now. As he entered the station, the officers behind the counter looked up, noticing the young boy with a baby in his arms. Their faces shifted from routine indifference to surprise as Jaden slowly walked toward them. He approached the desk, his heart in his throat, and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I have to give her back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's the baby from the news. I don't want to, but I know it's the right thing." The officers exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the boy standing before them. Jaden carefully handed the baby over to one of the officers, his hands shaking. I just wanted her to have a chance," he added quietly, almost to himself. One officer stepped forward, his expression softening. "You did the right thing, kid," he said gently, reassuring him that he wasn't in trouble. But Jaden didn't hear it. All he could hear was the sound of his own heart breaking as he walked away, knowing he had just let go of the one thing he had allowed himself to care about. The police station was chaotic, buzzing with activity. Officers moved around, coordinating their next steps, as the wealthy couple stood in the corner, waiting for any word about their missing child. Their faces were a mixture of exhaustion, worry, and hope. They had been frantic for hours, unable to process the horror of their daughter's disappearance. They had no idea where she was, or if she was still alive. When the news finally came, it was almost too much to take in. A homeless boy had found their daughter, alive, well, and safe. It didn't make sense. How could someone who had nothing risk everything to save their child? Jaden stood by the door, looking out the window as the couple approached. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he could sense the confusion in their eyes as they walked toward him. "Is it really true?" the mother asked, her voice trembling. Jaden nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had never seen people like this before. The rich couple, dressed in expensive clothing, looked like they belonged in a different world. And yet, here they were, thanking him for saving their daughter. The father, a tall man with sharp features, walked up to Jaden slowly. He seemed unsure of what to say, but he couldn't hide the gratitude in his eyes. "Why did you risk your life for someone you don't even know?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Jaden looked up at him, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea how to answer, but the words came from a place deep inside him. "Because I know how it feels to be alone," Jaden replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent. The mother's hand flew to her mouth, and the father's eyes filled with tears. They could see the pain in his eyes, the scars of a life lived in the shadows. They could see the truth behind his words. He had given up everything to help their daughter because he understood what it felt like to be forgotten, to be abandoned. The father stepped forward, his voice shaking as he spoke. "We want to thank you, Jaden. What you did, it's more than we could ever repay." And in that moment, Jaden knew his life was about to change. The couple, deeply moved by his words and actions, made an offer that would change Jaden's future forever. They would adopt him into their family, offer him a home, and ensure he would never be alone again. No more streets, no more hunger, no more fear. Jaden couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had no idea what a family like theirs could offer him, but the warmth in their eyes told him it was real. He could finally have a place to call home. The next few days were a blur of activity. Jaden was given a clean set of clothes, food, and a warm bed to sleep in. The house they took him to was beautiful, nothing like the dilapidated buildings he had known. The walls were painted, the floors polished. There was a soft bed with a pillow, something he had never experienced before. And in the corner of the room, there was a crib for his new baby sister, the child he had saved. As Jaden looked at the little girl, sleeping peacefully in her crib, something inside him stirred. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like an outsider. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a family, and he had a future. That night, as Jaden sat on the floor, looking at his new life, he smiled. He smiled for himself, for the little girl he had saved, and for the new beginning that awaited him. He wasn't just a boy from the streets anymore. He was part of something bigger, something filled with love and promise. He was finally home. Jaden stood at the edge of his new porch, looking up at the stars in the clear night sky. The quiet hum of the neighborhood around him felt surreal, almost like he was dreaming. His hands, once calloused and rough from years of survival, rested gently by his sides as he took in the view. He thought back to where he came from, the cold streets, the hunger, the loneliness. It had all felt like an endless struggle, like there was no way out. But everything changed that day, the day he chose to help, not knowing the life-altering consequences of his decision. He had saved a child. But in doing so, he had also saved himself. Sometimes, the family you save becomes the family that saves you. The voice echoed softly in his mind, words he'd never expected to hear in his lifetime, let alone believe. A contented smile crossed his face as he let out a slow, steady breath. For the first time in so long, Jaden felt at peace. He was no longer invisible, no longer trapped by the past. His future stretched before him, wide and full of promise. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living,